9 Golden Age stars critics said were terrible actors. They were the faces that defined an era: beautiful, glamorous, larger than life, and according to critics, some of the worst actors to ever cash a Hollywood paycheck. Says a former MGM publicity director who worked through the 1950s, the dirty secret of the studio system wasn't finding talent. It was hiding the lack of it behind beautiful faces and expensive productions. Welcome to Hollywood's most carefully guarded scandal: the stars who couldn't act. These were stars savaged by critics, but pushed relentlessly by studios that knew exactly what they were selling, and it wasn't talent. My job wasn't directing her, confessed one Academy Award-winning filmmaker about a blonde bombshell on our list. My job was pointing her at the camera and praying she didn't mangle the dialogue too badly. Yet these so-called terrible performers weren't failures. They weren't relegated to B-movies or forgotten. They were A-list celebrities earning fortunes, dating fellow stars, and appearing on magazine covers worldwide. How was this possible? What system could take critically reviled performers and turn them into international icons? And most importantly, why did audiences keep buying tickets to see people who, as one critic colorfully put it, could deliver lines with roughly the emotional depth of someone reading off a grocery list? The answer reveals the most brilliant con job in entertainment history, and why sometimes the least important qualification for becoming a Hollywood legend was being a great actor. Number 1. Jayne Mansfield, the bombshell who couldn't act. It was January 1957, during a flashbulb explosion outside Grauman's Chinese Theater. Jayne Mansfield stepped from her pink Cadillac, wearing a dress so tight it appeared painted onto her famous figure. The crowd roared, photographers scrambled, and studio executives smiled. Nobody cared that the New York Times had just called her performance an embarrassment to the craft of acting. Jayne was our nuclear option, a former 20th Century Fox publicist said years later. When we needed publicity, we'd unleash her in a dress 2 sizes too small, and suddenly nobody remembered she couldn't act. Critics were merciless. The Hollywood Reporter panned her for confusing volume with emotion, giggling with comedy, and exposure with acting. Variety trashed her performance in The Girl Can't Help It as the cinematic equivalent of watching someone read phonetically in a language they didn't understand. But here's where Mansfield's story gets interesting. You realize that she was completely self-aware. Jayne knew exactly what she was selling, and it wasn't Shakespeare. Cameramen remembered her blunt honesty on the set of one particularly tricky scene. After a 10th take, she turned to the director and said, "Honey, if they wanted emotion, they wouldn't have hired these," pointing to her gifts. Number 2. Tab Hunter, Hollywood's gorgeous empty vessel. Don't act, just react was the primary direction given to Tab Hunter in his early years, and for good reason. With his athletic build, wavy blonde hair, and striking blue eyes, Hunter was Warner Brothers' answer to James Dean and Marlon Brando. But he lacked their emotional depth. He had the emotional range of a coffee table, said director Max Westfield. The camera adored him. Acting coaches gave up on him. Reviews were brutal. The New York Times called him a handsome mannequin occasionally required to move its lips. Time magazine joked that Hunter didn't deliver lines. He survived them. But none of this mattered to the teenage girls who made him one of the era's biggest heartthrobs. A Warner Brothers publicist once joked that each expression Hunter could convincingly perform earned the studio $500,000, and by that math his 3 expressions made him valuable. Things took a turn for the disastrous when Hunter was cast in a musical, Damn Yankees, which required him to sing, dance, and convey emotion. Choreographer Bob Fosse was said to have thrown up his hands and proclaimed, "I can teach anyone to dance, but I can't teach them to have a pulse." No matter. Hunter's reign continued unabated. His record, Young Love, hit the top of the charts, and the fan magazines treated him like a monarch. Number 3. Mamie Van Doren, the bombshell assembly line goes too far. If Hollywood star system was an assembly line, Mamie Van Doren was the product that exposed the entire cynical mechanism. In the wake of Marilyn Monroe becoming a sensation and Jayne Mansfield being the one crafted as Fox's answer, Universal wanted one of their own. They created Mamie Van Doren's career almost from scratch. Critics didn't just dislike her, They used her to prove the system had become ridiculous. The New Yorker wrote if Monroe was champagne and Mansfield was beer, Van Doren was the stale water left at the bottom of the glass. Unlike the others, there wasn't even the effort to pretend she was talented for acting. "We don't need her to act," a Universal executive once said. "We need her to stand there and let us photograph her from these 3 approved angles." Directors resorted to simple editing tricks to mask her limitations. One line, cutaway, new angle, repeat. The cinematographer says their entire strategy was to keep her moving. Never let the audience focus too long on any single moment. The Hollywood Reporter panned her performance in Girls Town as stiff and awkward, that emotional scenes seemed to genuinely pain her. Number 4. John Derek. John Derek was the man who couldn't act emotion, who married women who could. John Derek's road to Hollywood superstardom should have been frictionless. With a chiseled face that appeared to take the best from Cary Grant and Tyrone Power, Derek was handpicked by Columbia Pictures' honcho Harry Cohn, who thought he could mold Derek into the studio's next great leading man. Millions were sunk into publicizing him, casting him across established stars, putting him in prestige productions. But there was one impossible hurdle. Derek had precisely one facial expression. Happiness, sorrow, fear, love, anger all appeared identical. A cinematographer who worked with him joked that Derek's face seemed incapable of changing. Directors would tease that he looked like he was thinking about nothing at all. Critics noticed immediately. The New York Times wrote that Derek stares intensely at his co-stars, presumably to indicate thought. Unfortunately, the intensity of his gaze is inversely proportional to the depth of his performance. His limitations became especially obvious when he shared the screen with truly great actors. In Knock on Any Door 1949, the contrast between Humphrey Bogart's layered performance and Derek's emotional flatness made their scenes unintentionally comic. After a long day of shooting, Bogart is said to have whispered to the director, "Is the kid stuffed? Should we check for a pulse?" Still, Columbia continued forcing Derek into dramatic leading roles through the early 1950s, though audiences and critics were losing patience. Variety eventually summarized the problem bluntly, saying Derek always delivered the same wooden performance he's given in every film to date. The camera loves him, but he responds with all the emotional depth of an attractive hatstand. Number 5. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis from Yonder Lies the Castle to Oscar nominee. Sometimes the problem isn't a lack of acting ability. It's being spectacularly miscast. When Tony Curtis, born Bernard Schwartz in the Bronx, started at Universal in the late 1940s, he possessed every physical attribute the studio adored. He had wavy black hair, striking blue eyes, and a physique impressive enough that his earliest roles existed mainly to show it off. But the moment he opened his mouth, another reality set in. Curtis brought a thick New York accent to ancient Arabia, classical Europe, and anywhere else the studio placed him. Reviewing his role in The Prince, Who Was a Thief, 1953, the New York Times noted the bizarre dissonance. He became a Hollywood punchline after the 1952 film Son of Alibaba, where "Yonder lies the castle of my father" famously sounded like "Yonder lies the castle of my fata." Even Cary Grant teased him. After working with Curtis on Operation Petticoat, Grant joked, "I hear Tony Curtis does a great impression of me. Shame I can't reciprocate. Can't do an impression of somebody who's not yet born." Critics were even less merciful, pointing out how often his accent unintentionally made for comic effect when up against historic characters. One such reviewer said that to hear Curtis attempt Shakespeare was like trying to watch someone do brain surgery with a butter knife. Number 6. Hedy Lamarr. The beautiful genius who couldn't emote. Hollywood has seen its share of odd routes to stardom, but none stranger than that of Hedy Lamarr. After bearing it all in the scandalous Czech film Ecstasy-1933, she escaped her domineering first husband in Austria and made her way to MGM. The studio head, Louis B. Mayer, hyped her as the most beautiful woman in the world, which is pretty much how audiences viewed her. But critics soon recognized an emotional blankness to her performances. The New York Times remarked that Lamarr photographed like a dream, but spoke her lines as if she was working out complicated sums in her head. That was truer than anyone knew. Unbeknownst to Hollywood, Lamar was a legitimate scientific genius. During World War II, she co-invented the frequency hopping technology intended to avoid missile jamming. Her work would one day be used as the base for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. A cinematographer who worked with her said she approached acting like math. She hit her marks, her lines perfectly articulated, but something essential was missing, the spark that makes a performance feel alive. MGM responded by minimizing her dialogue and maximizing her visual presence. Directors filled her scenes with lingering close-ups, elaborate costumes, and silent reaction shots. Jacques Turner once said that working with Hetty was like working with the Mona Lisa. Magnificent to look at, but you wouldn't ask the Mona Lisa to cry on cue. Critics described her as cold, mechanical, and wax-like. Time magazine wrote that she moved through emotional scenes with the detachment of someone reading a shipping manifest. Number 7. Sonny Tufts, the man whose name became a punchline. In 1943, America needed heroes both on the battlefield and on movie screens. With many established male stars serving in World War II, studios searched urgently for new leading men who could fill theaters. Paramount Pictures believed they had struck gold when they discovered Sonny Tufts. Tall, handsome, and carrying the prestige of being a Yale graduate from a prominent Boston family, Tufts appeared to have everything a studio could want. Early reviews supported that hope. Variety praised him as a promising newcomer after his debut in So Proudly We Hail in 1943. But as his career continued, critics and audiences began noticing a fatal flaw. Tufts might have been the worst actor ever signed to a major studio contract. The New York Times remarked that he delivered lines as if encountering both the words and the very concept of speech for the first time. What set Tufts apart, however, was the rapidity with which he became the punchline of an industry-wide joke. By the end of the 1940s, his name was a synonym for awful acting. His status as a cultural whipping boy crystallized when the satirical radio show It Pays to Be Ignorant adopted him as a running gag. Whenever some character would give a preposterous answer to a question, another would reply, "That's like asking, 'Who is Sonny Tufts?'" Which is to say that the very mention of his name was a joke. The gag took hold so thoroughly that when a 1947 Warner Brothers cartoon included an exclamation of suffering Sonny Tufts, audiences immediately recognized it as a jab at his execrable performances. Number 8. Dolores Hart, the star who chose God over Hollywood. Some Hollywood careers end in scandal or reinvention. Dolores Hart's ended in a monastery. In the late 1950s, Hart appeared poised for major stardom. She was beautiful, wholesome, and cast opposite Elvis Presley in Loving You in 1957 and King Creole in 1958. She seemed destined to become a major leading lady. Yet critics quietly noted something audiences overlooked. In a review of Where the Boys Are in 1960, Variety observed that while Hart had undeniable screen presence, emotional moments seemed to mystify her. She reacted to tragic news with the same pleasant expression she used in everyday scenes. This divergence between public enthusiasm and critical skepticism made Hart something of an oddity. Film historians have observed that she was miscast more often than not. Studios positioned her as the next Sandra Dee or Natalie Wood, but she lacked Dee's sparkling charm and Wood's emotional complexity. Directors started balancing out Hart's shortcomings by casting her with dynamic co-stars who could create scenes' emotional impact. A cinematographer observed, "The camera loved her, but often the microphone betrayed her inability to convey complex emotions." Number 9. George Nader, the studio creation who couldn't convince anyone. Sometimes a studio's determination to manufacture a star ignores all evidence to the contrary. In the early 1950s, Universal was intent on developing new leading men, and George Nader seemed like an ideal candidate. He was handsome, physically imposing, and had the square-jawed look executives believed audiences craved. But critics saw another story. Reviewing his performance in Six Bridges to Cross in 1955, the New York Times wrote that while Nader photographed well, he looked panicked when never required to display emotions stronger than mild contentment, as if he had forgotten something important. Despite the review's unrelentingly negative tone, Universal continued to push him. They cast him in high-profile projects and sank money into publicizing him, even as reviewers repeatedly used the same adjectives, forgettable, unconvincing, dead-eyed, to describe him. A veteran character actor summed up the problem best. "The studio wanted a star," he said, "but what they had was a mannequin." Directors harnessed Nader's limitations by writing fewer emotional scenes and adding more physical ones, which translated into several films in which Nader ran, fought, or stood stoically for more time than he could act. Another particularly scathing review likened his attempts to show emotion to trying to start a fire by rubbing two ice cubes together. Visible effort, no results.